Alrighty, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth-telling, myth busting. And so honored with the guests I have, we welcome back our returning champion, Elle Jones, Canadian Black leftist, social justice, racial justice activist, feminist, anti-imperialist, poet, journalist, often for the Black Power Hour, contributor to Halifax Examiner and The Breach, and she's a professor who teaches at Mount St. Vincent University. Al, very quickly, what do you teach at Mount St. Vincent University?
Politics and cultural studies.
Politics and cultural studies. What happened to Canadian studies?
Well, that's part of politics. It's politics, economics, and Canadian studies, and then also I teach in cultural studies.
Okay, fascinating. And she's also the author of a collection of her poetry, Live from the African Resistance. Her latest book, which I just started reading not too long ago, is abolitionist intimacies, and she is a social justice warrior, and that's always a compliment in my eyes. Don't know why it's an insult in the far
Mhm.
and an abolitionist. So we welcome her back to talk about animal rights. And as always, before we start, a reminder to our audience to please share widely all of One Plus One's content, past and present episodes, our playlists, and help us overcome the far right algorithms and the dominant monopoly Western corporate state media and pseudo leftist websites have in the social media world by sharing our content. Share us across social media and email. And please donate if you can to One Plus One at our PayPal. And if people are having trouble and would prefer an alternative form of donation, then please do get in touch with me at yurismouter@gmail.com. And sometimes Facebook blocks my ability to share One Plus One. So again, please share widely. It helps the show immensely, and it's our only way of overcoming colonial, pro-imperialist, sexist, heteronormative, and racist media. So now, on to the topic at hand. Firstly, Dr. Jones or Dr. L, whichever you prefer. Welcome back to
Well,
the program and happy Black History Month.
thank you. Happy Black History Month to you, or as we say, African Heritage Month.
All right. Yes. It's so stupid. I think I completely forgot twice to say that when I had Abiome of Pan African Newswire and Black Agenda Reports on. So I suspended. I completely blanked out to say that. So yes. So happy
Are
Black.
they even are the Black Agenda? Are they even like pro-Black history? Like, are they more like Black August people?
You know what? That's a very good question. Having seen the interview I saw of good friends of the show, Dr. Jared Ball of Black Liberation Media, and I mix what I like. Having seen his interview with my good friend Solomon Kamajan of Your World News, they did actually talk about that, and yeah, they would definitely be more Black History Month, Black August. But if it was Black History Month, it would be the
Black
proper
Liberation Month, yeah. So,
exact Black left or the real Black History Month,
yeah,
where they
yeah,
teach about all the revolutionary elements of WB Du Bois, MLK Jr. and so forth. So yeah, good points. And so Al, normally when when you're on the program, we often talk about Canada, we often talk about Black Canada, we often talk about your advocacy of abolishing the police and prisons, and a lot of topics related to that. But today, we're going to talk about the criminally overlooked and underreported, if it's even reported at all in leftist and left-leaning outlets, which is animal rights. So for those in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, who are lucky to study at Mount St. Vincent, talk to us about this course in animal rights for anyone lucky to study at SMV and have you as their professor teaching this course.
yeah. So, I introduced animal studies 2 years ago, I want to say. So this is the second time. We usually do everything in like a 2 year cycle. So this is the second year that I taught it. So it's really just an introduction to thinking about animals. Now, I'll say to preface this that I think one reason why, particularly like for racialized people, people aren't super into animal studies is for obvious reasons. Animal studies is typically skewed very white, very Western, often accompanied with like white saviorism. So in the work I do on police dogs, like I talk about how animals are weaponized by the state. And, there's like pages and pages and pages of stuff like Marines rescue dogs from Afghanistan, Marines rescue dogs from Iraq, which are clearly positioning, like the US invaders as moral and civilized, and Muslims who allegedly don't like dogs, as therefore inferior and more animal-like themselves, right? So obviously there's a long history of racialized people like Black people being compared to dogs. Um, Part of racialization is in fact animalization, right? So there's a whole host of reasons, obviously, why particularly, yeah, like Black people, Indigenous people are not particularly like bound up in the idea of animal studies because as many people say, when I was in Palestine, they were like, all these white leftist vegetarians, vegans, but like can't care about Palestinian life. There's also some very bad politics in animal spaces. Peter Singer, like, was allegedly like doxing pro-Palestinian academics, like extremely transphobic. Um, there can be quite a bit of racism with animal studies. Again, often accompanied to this idea that like the white West is correctly compassionate to animals and everybody else isn't. It's also very tied up, as Justin Marceau talks about, like animal studies is typically being very carceral. So classical animal studies animal rights as it's often um like enacted by mainstream organizations is mostly about criminalizing people for harming animals, right? So it becomes very bound up in carcerality. And so for all these reasons, it separates itself from liberation movements. So my work and the point of people like also Silanath Co., other like Black vegans or Black animal liberationists is to actually make the point that animal rights and the rights of oppressed people are actually intertwined, right? So they aren't competing rights. And also to push back on that very carceral mainstream, like de-radicalized version of animal rights and talk and think about how animal rights are part of liberation movements. Um, so that's what we do in the course, basically. So I don't know, I'm giving you a long rant, but I can give you some examples, I guess.
That's
So
fascinating,
yeah.
fascinating. And in fact, I actually do have a question about the dark side and some of the racist blind spots and whatnots that a lot of animal rights, even people I admire. So yeah. So we are
Yeah,
definitely
well, the
diving.
person to read if you're interested in the history of like radical animal rights and just as the person got me into animal rights, he only wrote like 2 or 3 essays. He wrote a book and like 2 essays and then disappeared. Is Jason Hribal. That's Hribal. Fear of the Animal Planet.
That's exactly the first I was going to ask you about.
Yeah, my favorite book. And that's what got me into animal studies. He has a brilliant essay as well about animals in the working class. And he traces how animal rights was co-opted from a very radical working class movement that understood, first of all, animal rights is deeply connected to work. So animals as fellow workers, right? So people worked for most of history alongside animals, and they still do in a lot of farming rural areas, right? So, um, oxen plowed your land, like you worked with sheep, you were a horse, you transported people with horses, right? So the animals were down in the mines, like horses worked on the battlefields, so the working class had a very close relationship working alongside animals. And so you had radical thinkers, particularly through the 1600s and 1700s, that understood that their lives under capitalism, which were being affected by like growing capitalism, was also affecting animals, and therefore they were like comrades in that, and also were very radical in terms of connecting animal rights to things like slavery. So a lot of the radical Quakers were like, I will never exploit an animal, and I'm anti-slavery, and they understood those things to be connected. So there's I forget his name now that came to the U.S. and was like not only like would not ride a horse, would not use or eat an animal, was also like vehemently anti-slavery as well. So for them, like in this working class way, they very much understood that they worked alongside animals, and therefore the things that were happening to the worker also happened to the animals, and their interests were intertwined. But then you get a very elite version of animal studies. I keep saying animal studies, of animal rights and animal welfare. So, like by the passing of the first animal welfare laws, those are largely passed against the working class. So as the cities expand in like the 1800s, rich people are coming in contact with actually like cattle slaughtering and stuff, and they're like, oh, the poor cows. So without thinking about the class dimensions of why like how working class people are also pressured alongside. Like you're pressured to get the meat, you're pressured to get the horse to market on time. So you might whip your horse because the horse isn't pulling the load. And if you can't get the stuff on time, you're not getting paid, right? So instead of thinking it in terms of all exploitation, it became like the primitive working classes that don't treat animals right, and the elite need to protect animals. So you start getting protectionism, which is a very elite saviorism idea, and that comes to define animal rights. So animal rights gets very much like detached from the idea of animals as co-revolutionaries and co-workers, and put into this realm of animals as innocent, helpless, voiceless objects in need of saving, which, as you might imagine, is also like better victims than the uprising Black people in slave rebellions in Haiti, better than the working classes, therefore, that are demanding rights. So animals are a safe place to have sympathy for because they're innocent and silent, and you can enact like saviorism on them. And also this very like Christian moralism. Whereas like obviously oppressed people don't respond the way you might want them to. Like they might be self-determined and like take up arms and want their rights. So Jason Hribal really traces that in this essay. I'm not giving it full justice, but it's a really good essay about this particular radical history that's really important. And then in Fear of the Animal Planet, he specifically talks about how animals understand freedom and like have all examples of resistance and fighting for liberation. And he sees them again as our like co-liberationists. So that's a really important frame, and that's obviously the frame I come to this work with. Um, we were talking in class last week about slaughterhouses, and there was a really good article about the conditions of workers in slaughterhouses and how those workers are migrants, people of color, like refugees. So the people that are most precarious, most oppressed also work in slaughterhouses. So it's not that these people are like psychos, you know, like, oh, they just love killing animals. So we have to see how the way animals get ground up in a like a death politics of the slaughterhouse is also the politics directed towards people of color, precarious people, and those things aren't separate, right? So that's how like a lot of the threads we try to pull on in the course.
Before I get to my third question, actually, just actually talk a bit more because that actually was my second question, which is talking to us about the historian, longtime advocate for of animal rights, Jason Hribal. Is that how you say his name?
Yeah, I don't know. And nobody knows where he went. Like those of us who, if you know, you know. It's one of those books that like a lot of cool animal rights people really like, but I don't know what happened to him. So if anybody out there or Jason Hribal himself knows what happened to him, like he's not on social media as far as I can tell. Like when you Google, so I don't know if he like passed, if he just like left doing academic work because he couldn't get a job. I don't know. But it's like the two of the most influential, like that essay and then Fear of the Animal Planet, and I think two of the most influential, like so influential in this turn in animal rights to recognizing the way that animal rights are part of, not opposed to, are part of liberation movements, which is a push not towards like Black people to include animals. It's a push to the white animal rights movement to be like, how can you be for animal rights and then like not consider how the way that you talk about animals and think about animals is extremely anti-Black, extremely anti-Indigenous, like extremely racist. You know, so it's just a corrective to that. I'll also say Justin Marceau's book, is a really important recent effort in that direction, where he really talks out how animal rights so often like diverges and separates itself from like Black liberation movements, anti-carceral movements, by again like advocating for all this like legal intervention
And
instead of actually taking a liberationist framework. Yeah.
I'm probably also I'm probably blanking on his name. I should have looked for him quickly when I was preparing the questions last night. But you familiar with the guy? But I'm not sure if I got his name correctly. Because it's been so long since I've been up on animal rights and so forth. But I think his name was Will Potter.
Are you thinking of Will Klimica?
No, I'm
No.
thinking of this guy called. You know what? Let me check really quickly. But it was a guy called Will Potter who I think was on the front line of like animal rights and was talking
Yeah.
how
I mean, this is
about
the
how
really interesting thing about animal rights is you have some of the most like hardcore people that like invade farms, and you know, like we've seen people like go to prison that literally go and liberate animals, right? So
yeah.
again, these are like real
And he was very
soldiers of
big.
anti-capitalism, right? Like a lot of anarchists
Exactly.
that like recognize that the same institutions that cage people that, you know, like and the way that capital, so I mean, if you think of it in a kind of like Marxist sense, the um like the animal death industry, which is the corporate agricultural industry, is the ultimate in capitalist worker abuse, right? Like the animals literally like in 24/7 like captured so that their labor of like their literal bodies can be exploited for meat, for flesh, for right. So many people have read it this way as the sort
Yes,
of ultimate
and it
grind
is
of
the guy.
capitalism,
Yes,
right?
yes,
Yeah.
it is the guy I was talking about, Will Potter, and he did a book. Let me and he did a book called Green is the New Reds, and it was yes, Green
I
is
actually
the
don't
New
know this
Red.
book, but yeah.
Green is the New Red, an insider's accounts of the social movement under siege. And yeah, and he's talking about how a lot of those like anti-gag
Ag
long.
gags. Oh yeah, so like animal liberationists are actually like very much on FBI watch list, designated as terrorists because they directly like again, just as indigenous land defenders are getting in the way of the resources, the agriculture industry is trillions of dollars. So when people go not only and do like very direct actions like liberating animals, but even just taking pictures. So one thing that we have in Canada and in the US and probably in Europe, I'm sure, is what they call ag gag laws, like agricultural gag laws, and it's literally making it illegal to witness animals. So to stand at the gates of a farm and take pictures of the condition of the animals, to enter a farm or a slaughterhouse or anything and take pictures of how the animals are treated. So a traditional way that animal rights and people have got the information out there because it's very hidden is people have got typically like got jobs in the slaughterhouse, got jobs at like the mink fur factory, got jobs in the farm, and then like wearing hidden cameras have got that information out. And then when you see that footage, right? So there's been a lot of moves to criminalize and ban entering farms on false premises, but also say like taking pictures of the animals in transit, which is one of the few places you actually see the conditions of the animals. So one of the things they always say is if people saw the conditions that animals are raised in, they would all like we would all be vegans. I don't think that's true because like I don't think the politics of side and witness like if everybody saw the genocide in Gaza, like we see things
Well,
all the time. Yeah.
in fact, I have to add this. Like, I've always been baffled. Now, look, I am not a perfect animal rights advocate either. Even though I know full well that the way we consume not just our food, but definitely the way we consume our meats, our fish, and so forth like that is detrimental for the survival of the planet as we know it and so forth. But I am very much, in favor of animal rights. I would like to, adopt, veganism and so forth like that. And but the thing that always baffles me, but I'm always baffled by the contradictions that leftists have, is for me, like, when somebody is, like, an advocate of animal rights, I just find it so, pardon my language, just so fucked up that you can be for animal rights, yet you can be for fucking, like, imperialism,
Well, this is the problem,
genocide,
right?
like
Because
Native
it's so
American.
tied up to this like white saviorism, including like offensive like uses of Black history and stuff, So like, and then literally when I was in Palestine, people were like, yeah, they care. Like, there's literally a situation in Gaza where this animal rights organization saved these starving donkeys and took them to a
It was
sanctuary.
it was PETA. It was PETA.
Yeah, and then
They're
like,
all about
but
like save like
yeah,
saving
but like
animals.
Gazan people, like that's fine, leave them there, right? And many people say that, like if you could see a pic, like you'll take a like see the cat in the rubble, but you don't care when an actual human being is in the rubble, right? So this, and again, it's based on these like very false Western ideas of compassion and empathy, right? So um, Berger actually talks about this in what's it called, like on looking when he talks about seeing animals. And he suggests that precisely because we no longer, if we're like in the urbanized West, have like we see our companion animals, we don't have like real contact with, horses, like animals, sheep on a daily basis, that this sort of sentimental image of the animal comes to stand in. So like stuffed animals, animal memes online, watching animal videos. And that has also made us overinvest in our companion animals, like our pets, So we're like, oh, my pet is my baby. And then we're okay with millions of cows, trillion, billions of cows, like being slaughtered, right? And like, still seeing ourselves in compassionate. So in Canada, it's like if you are seen on camera abusing a dog, like the country will be up in arms, right? But we have the stampede every year and multiple horses die in the stampede every year, but because it's corporate, then you're crazy, right? Like, so if you're like ban the stampede, then that's a loopy animal rights person. But then somebody will be caught on video abusing a cat, and it's like, oh, that person's a terrible person, and like their house will like be burned down, And so this is the disconnect in the West, right? Which is about like false, particularly white constructions of themselves as civilized and compassionate and empathetic often through this performance of compassion for their like companion animal, but then like literally no compassion for anything else. And this is exactly why people object to animals. Also, of course, like
Well,
I work
well,
on
well, 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 well. It's. I think this is the first or second anniversary of the death of my hero, John Pilger, and the first documentary I ever saw of John Pilger that made me go like, "Oh my gosh, that's what I want to do with my life. I want to be a journalist like this guy." The first documentary I ever saw of John Pilger was Death of a Nation, which was about Australia, Britain, and the US's support for Indonesia's invasion of East Timor, the horrendous genocide there. And of course, wonderful footnote, Canada also supported that. And he interviews one of the ministers, that's one of the conservative ministers of the Thatcher government, and I believe also the John Major government that was that like supported like Indonesia's invasion of East Timor, selling weapons to them, and even as the genocide there was getting like consecutively worse and worse and worse. And then John Pilger like asks him, he asks him this question, this conservative minister, saying like, I understand that that you believe in animal rights and and animal welfare. Doesn't that extend to doesn't that extend to people, like how foreigners are treated? And the conservative right wing minister literally like responds to him going, curiously, it doesn't actually. And for me, like my jaw still drops to that like what is wrong with you?
Yeah, but then if you look at the actual history of like colonialism, animal like human genocide is also accompanied by animal genocide, right? So very the famous image of the buffalo skulls, right? And so the like killing buffalo was directly connected to the genocide of indigenous people. It wasn't just overhunting, it was specifically to remove the food source, right? And then kill the culture, kill the way of life, and kill the people, and like remove people from land. And so these are the connections that so like capitalism is inherently anti-animal. This is based upon an industrial slaughter of animals, and it is also obviously inherently anti-black. So that doesn't mean we compare our like black people therefore like animals. That's not the point, right? The point is to say the same mechanism that is anti-black, that steals land, that is genocidal, that is anti-indigenous, that is colonial, is also fundamentally anti-nature and anti-animal as well. And that's where we're connected, right? So over and over again, we see like the destruction of nature, the wholesale killing of animals, often for genocidal purposes. I mean, a good example. So I work on the police. So a good example is like, I mean, I talk a lot about police dogs and how they get elevated to this like human status for performing state violence, right? So because police dogs catch criminals, therefore, like they can become like white humans. But if the police kill them and beat them, which they frequently do, then they just revert to being animals. Like then they're just canines, right? But if they die when they're like biting, in pursuit of a criminal, then it's a criminal. Then they're like elevated to this hero status and say, oh, they were family, they were more than just a dog, like they were like a person, they were an officer. But then when I requested from the place where they birth and train dogs in Canada, I requested the injury and death stats within the training facility. They said they don't even keep them. And I was like, I thought they were officers. So it's this like massive propaganda. So one of the things I talk about is how, especially post Rodney King, as like more awareness comes out about police brutality, the police really pivot to police dogs as this propaganda site, right? So like the state starts using like mentally, psychologically using animals. You know what I mean? So they'll do like name the puppy contests. They got really into doing police dog memorials for all the fallen officers that are dogs. Like we got a lot of, they started that in like the late 90s. They were going up in the 2000s. And that's, I think, directly connected to as the police lose public support is like, but you love dogs, right? And like, look at this amazing police dog. So then like, if you love dogs, therefore you love the police. And so they do this like transmutation, which is why they literally give like fallen police dogs public funerals, like full in-state funerals, right? But then the police frequently, especially in the States, kill companion dogs. So they like if they like
And
are
the
raiding your
military,
house
and the
and your
military too.
yeah, and your dog is barking, they kill your dog. And there's
I mean,
multiple videos of the
yeah,
police like slaughtering dogs in the street.
I mean, like,
So
2 weeks ago, I was watching uh, uh, 2 weeks ago when I had to cancel an interview on you because of my like stomach issues. I was watching a Channing Tatum movie, about him in the military with the military dog has to go to this funeral of his like fallen like human like companion and then throughout like the entire movie like he's trying to like argue with the military like you don't have to put this dog to sleep afterwards. Like, you can actually like retrain and so forth. And while I liked the
that's real though, because police dogs
but
like
while I'm liking this movie, at the same time, there's this psychological warfare, as Jared Ball often talks about, of like the U.S. military and like our boys going out to like sacrifice with their dogs, and it's just like, oh Jesus, man, like enough already. So like,
Yeah, and Justin Pache and Kevin Walby have talked about how oh sorry, you cut off and then I cut off. They've talked about how the police start adopting this military language, right? And you particularly see it. So like fallen heroes, he sacrificed himself. Like they use this language of like the fallen military hero for police dogs. Um, and yeah, like when you look at how they start positioning it, it's very clearly part of this propaganda, right? Um, but of course, the police dogs don't consent to be part of that, right? So, I mean, again, legitimately, Black and Indigenous people like fuck a police dog. I mean, yesterday I posted ACAB means the Zootopia cops too, you know? But like, so I'm not mad when people are like, fuck that dog, because dog bites are incredibly racialized. In Ferguson, when they did the Ferguson report after Mike Brown, 100% of dog bites in Ferguson were Black people. So, like, the way the police use and release dogs is like overwhelmingly on Indigenous and Black people. The stats which you really in Toronto, Black people make up like 8% of the population, 57+% of the dog bites. So like it's very clearly racialized how they use. So like, you know, obviously an Indigenous person that's like dogs literally returned us to residential schools when we used to track us down. Fuck a dog. Like that's totally legit. Black people are like that drug sniffing dog cop that came in my house. But what we need to understand is that dogs aren't consenting to that. And actually, the training of those dogs is incredibly violent. It's psychologically violent. It's physically violent. They have like spinal issues. Their teeth get all messed up. And they're like listed as high risk, high needs dogs. So when they retire, they can't just like go to the dog park. Um, they basically have to live with the officers. They can't just be put back into the pool of animals. They live this incredibly psychological, like isolated, you know, drug sniffing dogs get addicted to drugs. That's why they have to retire them. So when you look at how the animals are actually being abused in this system, the dog is not consenting to that. The dog doesn't choose to be an officer. The dog is being trained and forced and doing what a dog does, which is trying to please their owner. So then we start to see that as a form of violence on the dog as well. Plus, again, only like 13 to 30% of dogs make it out of police dog training. So one of the things I talk about is in Canada, there was this dog Bingo, like this Toronto cop dog that died, you know, like tracking down a criminal. And they had a state funeral for Bingo, you know, it was a big thing. Everybody, all the politicians condole. And they're like, he's more than an animal. Bingo was our friend. He was our partner. The same day as Bingo's funeral in, I think it was Virginia, 11 police dogs died in a non-air conditioned van that they were transporting the dogs that were already starved and abused. The dogs overheated and died. The local humane society tried to intervene, not only to like properly investigate, but to like save the remaining dogs. And the dead bodies of the cop dogs were thrown back into the van and they transported them to their final destination with signs of long time's abuse on them. And they said, the canines. So I'm like, I thought they were cops. I thought they were officers. So the police only conveniently treat animals as, you know, their co-partner and stuff when it serves their propaganda of, oh, they were killed by a criminal, but they kill and maim and abuse their dogs all the time. A Calgary cop was caught on tape, like kicking his dog, and they said it was the dog's fault because he barked and like messed up a rape. So this is where I think it becomes
wow.
Yeah, like so this is where I think it becomes interesting, right? When we start to think of like how the psychology of white supremacy is also part of this particular psychology around animals, right? So that they can both kill companion animals, they can slaughter animals en masse, like in countries they colonize, then hold themselves up as civilized and animal lovers, yet while they still have rodeos, while they still have a massive abusive industrial system, but then talk about how like indigenous people seal hunt, which is like small scale hunting, which PETA and stuff will focus on, you know, like completely disregarding like Inuit cultural ritual. But then like, you know, so these are the issues. And this is exactly why Indigenous people aren't going to be like animal rights people, as long as animal rights remains anti-Indigenous and talks about how like Indigenous people shouldn't wear fur or shouldn't hunt, as if that kind of small scale cultural like hunting is anything like the game hunting and like sport hunting that's done, you know, by like actual rich people. In fact, sorry, not to keep ranting, but the history of like animal preservation and wildlife parks was to protect hunting from the working classes for the rich people. So animal protection was about like, let's put this animal in a preserve so that the rich people can hunt them, but the locals won't have access to them. So like these are all the ways in which animal welfare is basically super wide and fucked, but animal liberation, like animals as our companions, is actually an important piece of our liberation movements. And like, I want us to make that difference and That's what I do.
Yeah, no, and we have to talk about also, like the weird, like contradiction of, like, people who claim that they're like animal rights and like dog is a man's best friend, and yet they warehouse every single animal you can imagine in zoos. I'm very, very anti-zoo, anti-SeaWorld and all that stuff. I'm also anti like aquarium. Like, for God's sakes, can you just free all the animals for F's sakes? And I don't buy into a lot of the propaganda like we have to hunt, deer
No,
and
this is
moose and stuff
Paul
like that.
Mooney. The white man is the nosiest man. Like, leave the whale alone. Like, why is the whale white? Like, you're not a whale.
But well, that's actually a perfect segue into all that. So let me ask you a series of these questions. Now, before we talk about these interesting Black sisters you wanted me to educate myself on, I think it's better first to talk about these two figures and their legacy. So, talk to us about your assessment. I'm very, very curious. Your assessment of the legacy of Jane Goodall with respects to both animal rights and climate change in the green movement or eco-socialist movement. What's your assessment of, and then what's your assessment of someone I do admire, but upon further research did have a dark side, and that's Dian Fossey, who great animal rights advocate, particularly of gorillas, and putting her body on the line and was murdered, but she did have a dark side. And so I'm curious your thoughts on both of these historical women, Jane Goodall and Dian
I
Fossey.
mean, I saw conflicting things on Jane Goodall because some people were saying that she was like anti-Palestinian, but Mazin Kamseh from the Palestine Biodiversity Institute, um, but like he sent out a tribute to her, and I trust him. Like that's his area. So I don't know. Like sometimes when you get things online, I haven't done like I didn't have time, or I just didn't do further research on it, I guess. But so by the way, the Palestine Biodiversity Institute, if you're interested in animal rights and stuff, I recommend people supporting that. You can volunteer there if you do are outside of Bethlehem, or send them some money. They're preserving the indigenous Palestinian species. And he said a really interesting thing when I was there, where he said that colonialism is not just destructive to human life, it's destructive to all life. And so this is a really good example of how it's connected, right? Because, Israel, which bills itself as, greening the desert, that's a lie, right? We know that Israel, in fact, has destroyed millions of olive trees and, in fact, imported fir trees from Europe that have completely destroyed the soil, have made it like that's why they're lighting on fire, right? Like when they're like, why are only the Israeli towns burning? It's like because you planted like completely inappropriate trees, right? So far from greening the desert, in fact, what they did is destroy the desert, destroy a number of ecosystems, destroy species that house other species, right? And so part of the work and the Palestine Biodiversity Institute has been raided and they've been arrested just for this act of like preserving seed and preserving indigenous species and, trying to, reclaim like indigenous owls and like create spaces. So literally at that level, Palestinians are not allowed to have access to seed because that would connect them to the land and it would obviously be a stake to their history as opposed to these European colonizers that came in and wanted to plant fir forests like back home and wanted to do all this, inappropriate European agriculture when of course Palestinians had been sustaining the land for, like literal millennia, right? So that's a really good example of exactly why this stuff is important. He sent a tribute around to Jane Goodall and like praised her solidarity with Palestinians. So I don't know. I mean, I think the problem is when we look back in history, sometimes people were for stuff like two state that now everybody's like, but was seemed sort of reasonable. I'm not going to say for Palestinians because there were always Palestinians that knew like one state, but I think we have a tendency to sort of, and if you weren't exactly where we are at this moment in your thinking 40 years ago, and again, I don't want to disregard like Palestinian thinkers that have always understood their own liberation, right? But I don't know if I'm willing to throw someone out because 30 years ago like they didn't know us, you know what I mean? Like, but I don't
Yeah,
know. But I'm going to
I,
listen to a
I,
Palestinian on this matter and say that I'm going to assume that she at least had some credible solidarity.
but yeah, I completely agree with you. I completely agree with what you just said. But when it comes to Jane Goodall, I mean, like talk more about like your assessment of her because some people, myself included, would say that she was way too Gandhian in her approach when it came to challenging power and stuff like that. When people criticize NGOs, either
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem, right? Anytime that you're like stomping around in Africa lecturing like African people about poaching and stuff without looking at the imperial roots of poaching. Like what again, first of all, like who poached all of Africa, not only of animals, but of like all our resources, our people, like, the 100 million plus like enslaved people. Like you want to talk about poaching, like, all our wealth, all our knowledge. Like, so yeah, again, like African people are gonna be like, let's talk about that before we fucking talk about elephants, you know what I mean? But like, obviously. And so, yeah, I think it's always complicated when you're coming in and lecturing like an indigenous peoples about like how evil they are for poaching or whatever without, again, understanding the forces, colonial, imperial, capitalist forces that motivate. Like, if my family's starving and I can get money for ivory, then, you know, like, so again, this is where we need to stop thinking of animal rights as separate and have an analysis. So, yes, again, just like I said with slaughterhouse workers, it's not that they're psychos, it's that like, we have to understand how that's a co-oppression, and we actually enhance each animal rights and human rights by understanding them together. So if we're an animal rights person, we have to advocate for the workers in the slaughterhouses who have like incredibly high rates of injury, who have like incredibly, like have to work. It's like Amazon floor, like you're peeing in diapers because they don't give you breaks. Like they it's like every 12 seconds they have to like kill a cow in these industrial things. Like they're massively traumatized. All those things are part of how we treat animals, and the victims become the most vulnerable people, right? And same thing for someone who's poaching. Like, are they evil? Are they trying to make money? And so I'm not, yeah, like again, like why are we going around lecturing like indigenous people on their treatment of animals, which is again like so held up as this like measure of civilized humanity. Like you're a better human if you treat animals well, but it's okay to be a good human and like sign a bomb that's going to land on a Palestinian shell, right? So again, it doesn't match up. So obviously, but there's some really like what we don't talk about is a lot of like people in the African continent who talk about animal rights in the context of animal liberation. I'm sorry, I'm going to forget her name, but there's this really beautiful essay on like elephants in Uganda, by this woman who observed that like after the genocide in Uganda, after the Civil War, like the male elephants were like stomping out people, raping rhinos, like raiding things. And she realized that just like her people were traumatized and destabilized. The elephants, which typically hear in matriarchal packs, herds, I mean, led by a grandmother matriarchal figure, they're very well organized. And because the families had been shattered, you saw, and she's like, this is like the young men in my village who are experiencing this. So she basically transformative justice the elephant. Like she found she added matriarchal grandmothers back to the packs and brought them next to the young male elephants and healed them. And a lot of people were like, oh, that's anthropomorphizing them. They're just beasts. But she was like, no, like we understand because we are seeing the same thing in our communities. So that's an example of an African person recognizing the humanity of her people and also connecting that to what animals suffer under this kind of war and violence without it being like saviorism, like let's save the elephant, but not save the boy who's been a child soldier or who had to defend his village or who's
So that so
traumatized from
that
seeing
so
war,
so
right?
so then what's your assessment of then somebody like Dian Fossey, who again, great admirer of of her advocacy for mostly gorillas. I like what she did to the poachers. I like that she took on like the big corporations in the zoo industry and the fur industry and so forth. But as I was doing some research into, into criticisms of Jane Goodall, I asked a follow up question when I was doing my research on like ChatGPT. And so for like, what is like the dark side or the controversial side of Dian Fossey? Because I thought it was all just a smear campaign, but apparently no. Apparently, like for all of her great like humanitarian work and her radicalism on the gorillas, when it came to people, cough cough, Rwandans, like black Rwandans, indigenous black
No, I
Rwandans.
mean, and this is so common. And yeah, I mean, you see it over and over again in animal studies. It's extremely white, it's extremely liberal, but again, I think that's what often gets publicized. And like what we're not talking about again, the number of people that are doing like real radical work, like disrupting the scientific industry, like disrupting farms, disrupting agriculture, and that are also anarchists, and that are also like workers' rights people, and that are also like radical Marxists, you know what I mean? So like again, I think what sort of is held up as animal rights is what's convenient to the state because loving a cat does not threaten the state. And what's buried by the state is when you actually recognize the connections of like capitalist agriculture to the war industry, to, like exploitation of humans. Like that's a very destabilizing move for the state. And so those are the people that end up in prison. Like those are the animal rights people that who are like some of the most committed. And this is what's so like interesting about animal rights conferences, because you'll have, on the hand, like lawyers, and then like very liberal people talking about we need more cruelty laws, with somebody who's like literally fucking rescued a whale from a tank, and like did time for it or whatever. And so there's this big spectrum of like so admirable people that really believe in, and like will die for animals, and will like risk their freedom for animals, and like really believe in this radical way in freedom. And then the very like fucked up colonial stuff. And I'm not going to excuse it because it's there, and people have, I mean, when I talk about dogs, the first thing everyone always says is Foreman getting off the plane with the German shepherds in the Congo, right? Like, and that's why people turned against him. Like, people always give me that example, and how like the Belgians
Yeah.
used German shepherds in colonialism, right? So they're like, fuck a dog. Like, I don't, my partner said to me, like, fuck you, you're gonna get reparations for animals. And they're going to be like black people still aren't gonna have shit, and they're gonna be like, very interesting work, Elle. Let's give the dogs reparations. So it's real, and it's something that black people consistently feel. That's not because we are compassionate to animals. Like that's not why. It's because animals have historically both been used against us, and also we have been animalized and treated as animals. So like
No, no,
nobody's going to buy into white people's nonsense about how they know better about freedom and liberation and compassion when they're actively like harming. So nobody gives a shit if some white woman wants to cry over a monkey, and then you're you're like not like collaborating with genocide. Like,
it's it's crazy. And then and apparently, when doing research into the dark side of Dian Fossey, like the AI I was talking to is like saying like, yeah, she was very yeah, she was very great when it came to her gorilla advocacy, but only was attacking a symptom, not how did all this stuff happen. All happened because of you guys, the Western imperialists, and the colonialism that was enforced on,
it's the same idea as,
Africans.
oh, Africans and Jamaicans are so homophobic. Well, yeah, but who brought like Christianity like at the point of a gunfire, right? So it's the same idea that until you're looking exactly like how, in fact, all of this is part of capitalist imperialism, like that analysis is lacking. And you can't just save the animal by extracting the animal from that. Like you have to see how, in fact, the condition of animals is that, I mean, they literally use like the fact that dogs are used in slave catching, the fact that they had an economy of dogs that they sent around, like the French traded dogs between like Haiti, the Louisiana, like Jamaica. There was actually Florida. So I mean, if you go back to Bartolome de las Casas, The Destruction of the Americas, he's talking about the Spanish using mastiffs to terrorize indigenous people in that book, that like an instrument of torture was the dogs. And then those dogs are bred up and both sent into the Americas to like hunt down initially brutalized indigenous people and then turn into slave catching dogs, right? So my point is that at the root of enslavement and like indigenous torture and removal and genocide is also the way that white people weaponize animals. It says something about it, right? Like that those things are actually inextricable. They were actually part of the slave economy. And so it's worth thinking about, right? Like
Yep. And that's a perfect segue to this question, which is, what's your assessment of PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, founded by British American animal rights advocate Ingrid Newkirk? Talk to us about good they do, bad they do, and the fugly and the ugly.
yeah, we just watched. I mean, people should watch I Am an Animal, which is a documentary that sort of lays it all out. I think both the good, the bad, everything. So, I think some of the things, again, like obviously the construction of animal rights is like white, female, like that has a long history of delegitimizing animal rights. So, when there was the what's called like the great vivisection debate, which was against dissection, right? So when people in particularly like Oxford were rising up against animal cruelty, um, through like vivisection, of course, one of the things that was being said is, well, you guys are irrational women. And actually they said old women of both sexes. So this idea that to be like soft-hearted for animals is feminine, and a real like scientist would of course rationally know that like vivisection is necessary and like animal cruelty is mad, right? So like it's always been feminized. And it's somewhat true. Like there are a lot of women in animal, but like why is that bad, right? So I think there's things we have to separate the smears, which are feminizing animal rights to delegitimize it. Oh, it's all white middle class hysterical girls. Again, to delegitimize it from things like its actual anarchist roots, the actual like radical roots. Obviously these slippery slope arguments like where does it end? So now do I have to like arrest someone because they didn't pet their dog? So like these total like those are all smears. But if you watch that documentary, you also see like her racism on like full display in that documentary. There's this scene. There's this
Pause,
scene.
pause, wait, pause, wait, pause. Okay, remind me of that. I watched that documentary years
Do
ago.
you remember the scene
Okay, so
where like
I watched that
he goes to
documentary.
that
Okay,
dog and there's that black man that has that dog?
wait, because I remember watching that documentary years ago when I was getting into like animal rights and so forth. So it's been a long time since I've seen that one, and it was a mostly complimentary like
Yeah,
documentary.
it's supposed to be, but
So
like
so tell me, what did I completely miss in that documentary?
okay, well if you remember, so I mean again, I like there's things I admire in animal rights, even the sort of most libby like white supremacist animal rights activists, I always admire people's commitment to the cause, right? We can always take lessons, like we can discard everything that's disgusting and keep people's commitment to the cause. And I will say that, yeah, like I mean, you will see that commitment on full display in that documentary, and that is admirable. People that are really willing to face like the slings and arrows of capitalist media for their cause, important. But uh this is like if you watch the song though, you probably don't remember this, but there's this scene where like they're going around, I don't know, like doing this like they go around and do dog welfare or something. So there's this like dog that a young black man owns, and she gets this all on camera. So the first question is, did this young black man really consent to be in your documentary? Like this is a young Southern black man, and the dog's like on a chain, so she's going, oh, like you're not feeding your dog properly, you're mistreating the dog. And the young guy's kind of like, well, and like, so you have this white English woman basically like just coming in and white saviorism at this young black man in the South, and, like with no like sense of obviously the racial privilege there, like the racial dynamic, the racial power. And then she's basically like, so I can take this dog, right? And he's kind of like, yeah. And I'm like, but so did you ask him like did he consent to be on film? If he did consent, did he understand what he was on film for? Like, there's such a history, of course, of just exploiting the consent of people that don't feel like enabled and empowered to say no, right? Like, here's this whole white film crew, and you've got this dog, and you're like probably scared they're gonna call the police on you, right? So you're just like, if she has to stick a camera in my face, I don't want her calling animal welfare and calling the cops. And like, there may be other things I have going on, and I don't want the cops on my property. I'm a black man, and they could shoot me dead. So if this white lady wants to stick this camera in my face, like, you know what I mean? So there's no consideration of that. And then they like euthanize the dog anyway. So they just take the dog and then kill it in like him or her in the next scene. So I'm like, okay, like what is that? And then she tells this completely bizarre story about her awakening as an animal rights person. She's talking about how she grew up in India and she saw what's clearly an Indian man beating, I think, a horse. And it's clearly
Cattle.
cow, yeah. Which is like, first of all, really in India, like aren't cows sacred in India? Like I don't think they needed your white self to protect the cows in India. Like I'm sure a lot of Indian people would also intervene if they saw a cow being beaten. Like, but she's like 6, and it's this complete white supremacist fantasy story that I don't believe, first of all, that she sees this Indian man beating a cow and rushes out and then beats him and then forces him on his knees to apologize. Like, so this is racial domination fantasy. Like, why is it an Indian man? And like, really, you think that this, and if he did get on his knees to a little 6-year-old white girl, it's again because he was terrified of this, that like the white girl's dad is going to come and cart him off to jail. So again, like, and this is exactly the history of animal welfare laws. Like, why might a poor person be beating a cow that's not cooperating? Like, maybe they have demands to get that cow to market. Maybe they like, so the solution is to fix the working conditions, right? Um, but ultimately, that doesn't mean people don't make their own choices. Like people are ultimately responsible for what they do. I'm not saying that no person ever should be held accountable for their violence towards animals. But what I'm saying is like, again, like telling this is your origin story, which is such a white supremacist, like white racial domination fantasy of making like a brown man when you're a British person in India, like get on his knees and beg for forgiveness from you. Like it's gross. So, you know, The other funny thing about that documentary, if you watch this, is clearly the people who work with her like don't like her. You should rewatch it. It's kind of funny.
Yes, it's going to be fun to rewatch that. Just like
But I mean, with that said, like
you
I will
know,
give her
just
her
like
dedication.
just like I've had
Like,
like black women like say to me like I need to rewatch Chris Rock's Good Hair.
yeah.
Like a lot of black women like saying like, dude, did you notice the misogyny and like the self racism Chris Rock was doing? I was like, really? Okay, I gotta rewatch this documentary one time. So I'm gonna do that as well as the Ingrid
But
Newkirk.
at the same time, in that documentary, you see like some really good tactics, like the farm invasions, getting like the footage of the animals. Like, so again, yeah, like I think there's some criticism of PETA that's like knee jerk based on smears,
Yeah.
and then some that is legitimate, like their use of slavery in their rhetoric. Like, yeah, like I mean, that documentary, you see like this anti-blackness that goes unexamined. So there's real critiques about how they position themselves, also how they work with other groups. Um, like I think there's a lot of like radical animal liberationist groups that also have a problem with them, for the opposite reasons. Um, so I mean, but that's true of any group, I guess. So
Yeah.
I mean, I think eventually at some point, yeah, we take what we learn, we take the good tactics, and then we critique the bad and build something better. But again, like there's a lot of you don't need to invest in like PETA because there's a lot of like radical groups, including like groups by Black people, groups by anarchists, groups by like genuine liberationists that are doing this work, right?
Well,
So
but before we get to them, and I have to ask you this question about Paul Watson. Known as a defender of whales, often will sabotage whale hunting boats, and I don't know if he does, other work on, like dolphins and porpoises. I know him vaguely about whales, and to the point you were making about about the anti-indigenous and like the like three-tier like criminalization of indigenous people and black people that love animal rights, the mostly large white ones, left-leaning ones do. I never saw this, but he had a debate. Paul Watson had a debate with War Churchill, very known American Indian movement guy, very well known, like
isn't he a pretendian?
some people say that it's a smear, and
Okay.
and Russell Means stuck by him when those smears and allegations were being leveled at him. So and that's important to note. That's very important to know in the historical record. And I never saw the debates, but
Wait, but then I gotta give you, sorry, this is a total distraction from animal rights, but Anime Aquash was from Nova Scotia, from Mi'kma'ki, right? So AIM is not welcome in Mi'kma'ki because of Anime Aquash. So Russell Means is like not welcome on these territories. Just to
yes, but that's a whole another story, which is
that's
also
a
related
whole,
to
but just I feel like
which is also
Mi'kmaq
related to
woman wouldn't forgive me if I didn't bring that up.
yeah, which is also like related to like like the freedom of the semi freedom of letter pelts here. But that's another topic for another day. But the point I was trying to make is Paul Watson, who's known as this like defender of whales, will sometimes sabotage like whale hunters and so forth. Now I never saw this debate, but he had a debate with Ward Churchill, and the debate was about like animal rights and the fact that like a lot of animal rights folks say to like indigenous Inuit hunters and so forth that you cannot hunt this whale, you cannot hunt like this seal and so forth, and and of course that goes back to the point you were trying to make about the mega problem of sometimes
Well,
it's very well intentioned, but these often largely like white
and
animals.
also it's not like vegan leather doesn't destroy the environment, right? So this idea that if an indigenous community hunts one whale, which they're going to use all the pieces of, right? They're going to actually use that whale, that's somehow more destructive to the environment or the animal than you going around and like, guy, when you're in your boat, you're releasing oil into the ocean that's like harming animals, right? Like, so the production of like pleather, vegan leather, and that things like puts chemicals into like the soil and the water that are destructive to animals, right? So, this idea that indigenous communities because they're hunting a seal or a walrus or a whale, like anything on a blip, like compared to not only the vast animal scale destruction of, the white supremacist industries, but also even the so-called alternatives, which involve shipping and all this stuff that still harms the environment. So it's just, yeah, I mean, and that's a business for again. So indigenous people already have their own like codes around hunting, their own spirituality, their own ceremony, their own ritual, and they will intervene with, if somebody's hunting in a way that isn't good and that is destructive, their community is also going to hold them accountable for that, right? Like indigenous people have been managing and sustaining the environment long before people got here. So like, and that isn't to say again that there isn't people that, won't like, like we the Mi'kmaq people here also own like the corporate lobster fishing. I'm sure that involves like Clearwater, right? I'm sure that involves like large scale exploitation of animals, but that's also a conversation for like Mi'kmaq people to have with each other. It's not a conversation for. So if Mi'kmaq people are interested in interrupting this, there's like Mi'kmaq ways to do that. I just don't know that like that should be the focus. Like if you're white, focus on your own community, which is where all of this stuff comes from before you go and critique an indigenous person for hunting a deer and then using that fur, like, and eating it. And like there's just
Especially,
so I mean, on a like really absolutist level,
like
you can say like, well, yeah, like you shouldn't harm any animal. Like, and I mean, we can get into that. Like, should we slap a mosquito? Like, isn't a mosquito, like
yes,
those
you
are
should slap a
ethical
mosquito.
questions.
Those
Right?
are not
Like
ethical
these
questions.
are
You should slap a
ethical
mosquito.
questions, but in a practical way, like it's just not, yeah, it's just so white saviorish. Like it's so colonial. And again, it goes back to the way that animal rights people just see animal rights as part and parcel of this like white superiority and like white civilization that needs to educate indigenous people, whereas indigenous people have had animals as part of spirituality, have had animals as part of ritual, have been correctly using animals, like and there is indigenous veganism as well that does square this circle around like you know traditional hunting and cultural meaning of this, and also how you can like the need for veganism within that. And again, that's their conversation to have, right? Like,
But we should wipe out like mosquitoes, flies, and like cockroaches and termites and all that jazz. Come on, like we should. But anyways, that's another story for another.
but I mean, like, you can have obviously like if you start having this as a theoretical ethical discussion, then yeah, you have to ask those questions, right? But like on a practical level of what it
Right,
means to live in a
but
capitalist exploitive world, I'm not worried about in Inuit communities seal hunt. I'm worried about the massive slaughterhouse of pigs and like the industrial chemicals and antibiotics going into the like that's what I'm worried about.
but then but any other assessments you want to make of Paul Watson before I ask a follow up question?
I mean, again, like I think one of the places that really good direct action has survived is in animal rights, whereas like I mean, yeah, I think where a lot of movements, I mean, we're seeing it come this it like we're seeing people confront ICE directly and stuff. So once in a while we have these outbreaks so people like go back to direct action. But a lot of movements have been suckered into like inquiries and reports and like this very orderly stuff. And I think animal rights are some of the people that still do like straight up, like, I'm going to ram this boat, like I'm going to burn down this farm, like so
Or
yeah, I
like
think
or like what like Dian Fossey did, who would do like mock executions of the people who were like killing gorillas and like really was like she was ahead of her time when she came to anti-zoos like
mm,
and the whole nonsense of like the conservations and like let's get these wonderful like middle class and like rich like white people or people of like all colors who there's like the lion over there and like there's like the monkeys over there and like she really called out like like that's uh like kind of like faux like conservation and stuff like that. But then of course comes like also like the dark side that like for all of their like like anti-speciesism still like just like did not give a shit about like the colonized, the marginalized, and and stuff like that. So
and we also have to like reclaim this idea that only white people have models of animal rights. So, I mean, a lot of people talk about the cats in Turkey, right? Like, you don't have to own a cat in your home, right? A community can care for, as you see in Turkey, where everybody cares for the strays, but they just like they're not owning them. They're still on the street. They're still, but then you feed like there's communal models, and you see that in a lot of countries that are accused of like not having animal rights, but yet people will engage in these communal forms of animal care. But just because it doesn't fit like this white Western model of like I have to personally rescue the dog and the dog has to personally become my baby, like that doesn't mean that people aren't like necessarily caring, right?
But
And I also want to talk about like Sulala Animal Rescue in Gaza, right? Which is a example of people that are being called human animals directly and that are directly animalized by Israel in order to justify a genocide. And what does it mean to be among the rubble and be rescuing animals as a Palestinian? And like, like that is part of the Palestinian resistance and commitment to the land, right? Like that's not animal rights as separate from Palestinian life. That's Palestinian life also being like preserving our animal life is preserving our connection, our relationship to nature. And of course, the occupier is going to kill it all, but we're going to preserve it all, right? So these are very powerful like inflections. And I think that's what we need to focus on, what that means. And like all those instances that we see this radical animal solidarity and animals as part of the solidarity movement. So all animal rescue isn't like white savoring. It's part of their preservation of resistance in Gaza, right? It's
I
part
have
and
to,
parcel in the same way as there's cultural resistance in Gaza, right? Like,
but then I have to ask this follow up question before we talk about the two black feminist vegans you wanted me to do research on. Then I have to ask, this follow up question. I haven't been in touch with her in a long time, but there's this lefty YouTuber I know, Trish, who is an outspoken animal rights vegan advocate and so forth like that. And she, once said, in one of her, live streams, she was talking about the people who push back against her animal rights advocacy and her veganism, like saying, well, like indigenous people have traditionally been like hunting like these animals like for years, and so forth. And she was pushing back against that argument, like saying, well, there are lots of like like inhumane traditions that we've stopped engaging in, the abuse of like animals for like fur and for food and so forth, or just for entertainment, should also be part of that. I thought that was an interesting argument. What would you say to
yeah, I mean,
like your comrade?
again, like it depends how absolutist you are on veganism and like, so there's like a spectrum of that. Like people that are like absolutely like the number one thing is we should not use, abuse, exploit, eat any animal. And then there's people that are more focused on like the corporate capitalist aspect, right? Um, I would say that, and I mean, I'm not indigenous, right? But like to say, oh well, lots of cultures become outmoded. That it's different when your culture is under genocide, right? Like you're not voluntarily giving up aspects of your culture. You've had it forcibly taken from you. Again, we have to recognize how banning indigenous people from hunting was a key element of genocide, right? It was like putting in really restrictive hunting seasons so that people could only be on the land for 2 or 3 weeks and then criminalizing people, like throwing people in jail for being on their own lands. That was a huge piece of removing, starving people deliberately. So people had to go and use script and like go to the store and buy like unhealthy white food instead of their traditional foods on their own lands. Like breaking the tradition of hunting, breaking the family structure. Like we can't just say, oh, well, but you could end that. Like that's what the state did. Like that was part of killing indigenous people. That's part of genocide. So to then turn around and say to indigenous people, you could just stop hunting as if it's not connected to forced starvation, forced land removal. Like I just don't think it's like the appropriate intervention. You know what I mean? Like, there is a Margaret. I'm so terrible at thinking of names off the top of my head. She's Dal Prof. She actually has a really good article on the Mi'kmaq veganism, and I prefer to focus on like indigenous thinkers. Billy Ray Belcour has a really good essay on decolonialism and animals, right? So there are indigenous thinkers that are thinking about this within that context of recognizing genocide and also recognizing how genocide took place on nature and also reckoning with indigenous culture. And they don't need us to come in and comment on it, right? And we need to recognize that, yeah, like again, these things are part and parcel of colonization. So it's, I think, quite offensive to turn around to Indigenous people and talk about like you can discard your culture when Indigenous people are literally trying to reclaim their culture at all points. I'd had to resist and like be imprisoned and like hold on to their cultures and language like at like such a cost. So I'm not going to turn around and be like, you could just like stop hunting when you still have Inuit communities like passing that down and like holding on to that. And
Yeah,
talking about how the community, like, literally moving in, like that was Canada, moving Inuit people out of their communities into like, settlements and then murdering all their sled dogs. That's what the RCMP did to prevent them from going back out on the land. Like, that's what actually happened. And deliberately meaning so that they couldn't hunt. And then the impact that like had on generations, like the trauma, also residential schools accompanying to that. Like, it's too much you can't just unpack that and take out one piece and be like, well, you should not hunt animals now.
yeah, no. In fact, completely agree with you. And when I had Rania Masri, the great Lebanese American eco-socialist, also like you, wonderful, flaming left winger, so forth, and, had her on to talk about. Mostly to talk about historic Palestine, and we got into the conversation about climate change and so forth like that. I talked about the people who say that that we have to stop eating animals like tomorrow if we want to live on the planet. And she said to me that there is still the dark side of even something as noble as the conservation movement and the early environmental movement. It still was about like displacing
Yeah.
Native Americans.
And Israel does
building
that.
this
They create
building
national parks allegedly to preserve species and nature, which is really about Palestinian land theft. Yellowstone was started basically to, like, again, like preserve that for like elite hunters. Wildlife preserves in Africa were literally to preserve the hunting for rich white hunters and not, which is like the Dian Fossey thing, right? So like the local hunters become poachers, but the white elites can come in and shoot lions to like their heart's content, right? So yeah, that's like a huge piece and still, like, Israel is a really good example of how they keep using like national parks and preservation and nature preserves as an arm of colonialism. That has not gone away.
Yeah, yeah, and like Teddy Roosevelt, Nobel Peace Prize winning like Teddy Roosevelt, people lionized for his like conservation and stuff like that. Oh my gosh, one of
And
the
like when
most
I
like
say that,
horrific like
this is a question
eugenics,
for
like
Indigenous people,
anti-indigenous.
or this is a question for Palestinians. It's not even identity politics, not that there's anything wrong with that. It's like the fundamental community organizing principle, right? You cannot bring people liberation. Liberation comes from within. So there's never any use of going into someone else's community and lecturing them about, like, it has to come from within. People understand liberation, people understand justice, people understand compassion. Not all people, like, obviously, because that's why, but there are always people and so it is on them, and it is our job to support those people if they ask for it, materially or otherwise. But it is never our job, because it will never work to go into someone else's community and culture and tell them what they should be doing. Like, that is fundamentally poor organizing. If you want to effectively organize, you cannot do that. Just like you can't walk into someone's family and tell them like what to do. So I'm not even saying this it's like on a basic level. If you want to bring animal liberation, the worst thing you can do is start opposing animal rights and human rights, start lecturing people about like how they should or shouldn't eat meat, how, like, it's not going to work. You have to get people convinced that their liberation is bound up with animals and then act accordingly, right? Like, so I just, on a fundamental level, like, saviorism does not work, and we should not engage in saviorism. And it's never helpful for us to say, oh, you should stop doing this, you should stop doing this, you should stop doing this. People within that community and that culture already understand the harms in their community and culture, and they work to change it and educate in their own culture from their own position.
But that being said, but this goes to I know I said I was going to talk about the two black vegans, but
I know, and we do have
I
to.
have to ask,
I got to do some work, but
but I do have to ask this question then, which is, isn't the big problem, the big conundrum when it comes to animal rights? And again, like, I would love to stop us using animals for fur, and like I would love to like adopt veganism and stuff like that, because I know that like the way we consume our food in general, but the way we consume our meat is going to end like existence for us as we know it. The planet will still be here, but all of us, including all the species, are going to die. And but the real problem and this problem and this probably goes to our like our own like blind spots is I know for a fact like if you were to tell even the most like radical like environmentalists like eco-socialists this they still will not give up like eating like the meat tomorrow. I mean like how many times have like I quit smoking, know how bad like it is for me, but shit, you can give me like all of like the most disgusting like pictures in the world. I'm still gonna smoke my damn cigarettes and like F you for like raising like the prices on it.
Yeah, I mean,
Like
this is
that's and I think that's the exact same thing when it comes to like animal rights. Is that it'll take us, and maybe we don't have and maybe we don't have generations, and maybe the planet is definitely fucked in that respect. But it'll take generations. It'll take literally generations to like get us to adopt like veganism and for like all of us to say like yeah animals are completely like equal to us. And I think deep down inside animal rights advocates and like radical vegans must know that they must know deep down like inside but
well,
and
it's like any
yeah
other abolition movement, right? So you have some people that think it's a good thing that we have, like a lot of people doing meatless Mondays or, there's like more vegan options. So even if you compare to like the 70s or 80s where vegetarian was like a punchline, like it's normal to be vegetarian now. There's vegetarian options so some people see that as a win. Some people see it as corporate co-option of a radical movement, right? So the very idea
there's
that
hope.
McDonald's will have like Beyond Meat in the same industry that slaughters all the cows, like that's actually, so there's a read that that's not actually progress, right? That's actually integrating something radical into an existing corporate structure, which we know that they also do for feminism, for, like corporations making Black Lives Matter statements, right? So that again, like there's like abolitionist reforms and reformist reforms, and like you have the same debate within the movement, right? I mean, I personally have never experienced it berating people about like people are just so sensitive about meat eating, Like if you say you're a vegan, it's like, fuck you, I'm eating a burger right now. So it's clearly not like an effective strategy. So the question is there an effective strategy? I think people are more convinced, like there's been documentaries on the horrors of industrial farming, and people are certainly convinced by that. Certainly eating local and stuff. I mean, but still slaughtering cows. But I don't know. So I mean, the question is, do you move incrementally? Are we absolutists on this stuff? But on just a practical level, like you say, on an ethical level, should we all be vegans? Yes, like probably like yes, but in practice, in a battle between human convenience and like any rights, like including animal rights, we know human convenience always wins. That's why none of us walk to work and we still drive, right? Like, so it's the same thing for the environment. So it's the same question that we have with environmentalism. We know something's bad for us. We know long term it's not sustainable. Like that's not going to stop us from living in convenience and comfort. So the question is how to practically like ameliorate that, right? And
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
no, and like I said from the get go, I myself, who is an advocate of animal rights, I'm an example of like how much of an imperfect animal rights
Well, I mean, like I can obviously
advocate.
say the impacts of the environment, but I'm gonna drive to work tomorrow, so fuck me, you know what I mean? Like, which is just like human nature.
But yeah, and that's and like I think like part of me like finds like in like our but that's why I often ask this question when it comes to like environmentalism is, for example, there was that documentary Planet of the Humans, which showed that all of these supposedly green, sustainable solutions still require mining and stuff like that, and are still anti-ecological. So what do we do? Do we just say, you know what, the planet is the planet is effed, but we still transition to this supposedly green, sustainable economy because that at least gives the Earth's lungs like a few more years, or do we just say like, okay, like we're screwed, so like party like it's 1999?
And I mean, this is the question confronting any liberation movement that was not going to happen in our lifetimes. Same thing with prisons, same thing with police. So how do we effectively leave something for the next generation and position, like, so this is Mariam Keba's point about reformist reforms, which are about the status quo, and abolitionist reforms, which recognize we're not getting the whole pie right now, but are taking like correct steps towards the goal we want, right? So that would be the same question for animal rights. Like nobody's going to just like, everyone's not going to convert to veganism tomorrow. So what are the ways we can start shifting how people think? Because it's not just people's actions, right? There's an ideology around animals being less of this, like well ingrained through religion, through philosophy, through science, through ideology, right? And so it's also, you have to, same thing with policing. We've talked about this. You have to chip away at the ideology first. Um, and
Now,
part of the problem in the West is people are already convinced they're good, compassionate people to animals because they love their cat. And so they're not even willing to confront the anti-animal ideologies. Like, because they think that they're just good people because they like looking at dog videos and they like puppies, right? Like, so this is exactly the problem. It's like Canadian smugness writ large, like animal smugness, right? And we do have to, sorry, I'm not even prepped for work tomorrow. So let's talk about Afro and then I gotta go do some PowerPointing.
yeah, okay. Say the best for last because it is Black History Month. So excited for you to talk to us about SIL and AMFCO.
Yeah, so there's a really good book. Um, oh my God, why am I blanking on the name? Aphorisms? What's it called?
I believe so. I believe so.
Yeah, aphorisms. And it's essays in Black veganism, feminism. So it's a radical book by these two Black feminists that connects again, like if Black veganism to liberation. So they see Black veganism not just as about eating meat, but as about a like orientation to the world, right? So again, it's recognizing the racial histories of animals, the white supremacist histories of animals, like a lot of stuff I've talked about. They recognize, right, that the white supremacist state is also a harmful state to animals and nature and the land. And so part of Black liberation is orienting yourself towards animals and towards nature. Something that we've also been cut off from, right? Like Black people, because we're like in a racist way seen as again like close to it. So there's an argument, I'm gonna forget, is it Rodinger, like David Rodinger, that talks about how whiteness orients itself as a cosmopolitan and civilized identity. So the construction of whiteness is around the idea that white people are civilized and therefore can separate themselves rationally from nature, and then primitive people are close to nature. So whiteness at once has a disdain for like nature, but also a nostalgia towards it. So whiteness is
That sounds something almost similar to the people who would defend indigenous people but still be racist by the
yeah.
North
Well,
South.
this is actually his idea of the fundamental paradox of whiteness, right? So whiteness forms itself as an industrial identity and says the reason why I'm superior to you is because I'm cosmopolitan, I'm industrial, I'm urban, I'm separate from nature. I'm a rational creature. I'm not like you, I'm not in nature. But then the minute whiteness separates itself from nature, it desires and has nostalgia towards what it feels it has lost, right? So this is like the British going into South Africa and like being like, oh, the Zulus or even the Boers, right? Like they can like this is the founding. Like Boers were also white, you know what I mean? But this is like the founding of Scouts, right? Where they're like, oh, we're getting our ass kicked because they know the bush and we don't because we become soft, right? So this constant, yeah, Baden Powell it's because they were like, we can't track anymore because we've separated ourselves too much from nature. So we need to have this like paramilitary organization scouting for boys to teach them these skills that we're appropriating from indigenous people that we at once glorify killing but want their skills, right? Like that's the whole like fuckery of whiteness, right? Like so this is why white people simultaneously are like Black people are uncivilized but they dance so good. You know, like we don't have rhythm anymore. Indigenous people are like elves. They like know nature, but they're also primitive, right? So it's this constant dance in whiteness, which is also the relationship to animals, right? Like we are hyper civilized, so we've lost our connection to animals, and we will like. That's why they always like spirit animals and stuff. They'll steal from indigenous people, right? So there's this like fantasy nostalgia that they have around a perfect relationship to nature, but they are constantly destroying that and in disdain of that relationship, right? And so the point is that, yeah, like this is so whiteness, like anti-animalism is at the heart of like the contradictions of whiteness, like the contradictions around their own violence, like the contradictions around like their own place in the world. And this is what Black veganism, so this is like why this matters to Black people, right? Like undoing this idea that industrial is best, that like civilization means separating yourself from nature. Like this is also environmentalism, right? Like we're not going to become environmentalists until we stop believing that we are apart from nature and that it is our like God-given or civilization-given like position and entitlement to be separate from nature. Like there is no such thing as nature. They're just like the world is nature. But we believe that we can create these artificial spaces that are nature-free, that are also bug-free. So we need like pesticides and that we can control like the growing of this is Vandana Shiva, right? Like that we can control pests, like we can kill pests and we can like literally control water and we can even trap the sun and we can control all these aspects of nature. And we're constantly trying to place ourselves above nature, which religiously is seen as our position. God gave us dominance over the Garden of Eden, and scientifically is seen as like technology, and philosophically is seen as rationality. Like we're not. So this is like, and this is where I mean. So like, this is where you start to see that nature, animals, land is fundamentally underlying the relationship to capitalism. So yeah, Black people need to be into this shit, and so and AFCO are, and you should read the book.
Yes, and you're asking
And
there.
it's a fundamentally radical Black position to be pro animal. But
Yes, and the wait, one moment. No. Yes, and the book title that you were asking about is called Afromism: Essays on Pop Culture, Feminism, and Black Veganism from Two Sisters. I'm automatically thinking of our mutual friend Bernita, who is an indie sci-fi fantasy author, and
yeah,
curious if she and yeah, very, very curious if she's familiar with that. So very interesting. Now,
there's also a really good oh my gosh, Boysonet about Black people and dogs, Afro Dog. There's a really good book on like the historical relationship between Black people and dogs. So there's more and more Black people like entering animal studies, Black and Indigenous people from a radical decolonial viewpoint, which is helping to shift animal studies. And as I said, Justin Marceau's book Beyond Cages is really important. Um, like calling out that yeah, it's really carceral like animal welfare idea. So there's really two wings in animal studies. There's the people that are very critical of this stuff and like classical animal rights, and then yeah, the people that just want more laws. Like the animal rights basically starts and ends with more laws to imprison people who commit animal cruelty, right? And so like you'll see that tension if you go to animal rights conferences or animal studies conferences, right? So yeah, I mean, I understand entirely why brown, Black, etc. people are completely put off by animal rights, but I encourage us to look deeper into the radical histories and radical present.
but I
And
wonder, but I just wonder if if this planet still has a chance. I mean,
no,
just even in the
and
environmental.
also fuck a zoo.
Yes, yes, I completely agree with that. But just when you think about so many wonderful, noble people power movements, it could be the feminist movement, it could just the environmentalist movement alone. It's crazy how so much of the environmentalist movement doesn't address the issue of animals. Doesn't even address the issue of militarism. In fact, some people want to green
Dude, I wrote, there's an
military.
animal party in Canada that ran in the last federal election. They had like three people. And I wrote them and I said, well, what's your position on genocide in Gaza? Because that also harms animals. They didn't even write me back. So you're an animal party, but you can't speak out against genocide in Gaza, which is like when they bomb, like it's not like the animals get transported somewhere else, right? Like your kitty cat gets bombed when the house is bombed. If you destroy 90% of Gaza, what do you think happened to all the companion animals, right? Like, so I'm like, clearly being an pro-animal is being anti-war. Like, war harms animals, it destroys the environment, destroys their habitats, it poisons the soil, it poisons the water. Like, Gaza has like live munitions all over it. Like, the water is permanently poisoned, like the chemicals, the white phosphorus they've been using. Like, these are complete like ruptures in the environment, and you're going to be pro-animal, and then you can't have a statement on Gaza. Like it's and this is exactly what you're observing. Like it's a complete mental disconnect.
But is a solution make Elle Jones queen of the world.
No, I would be like
Make Elle Jones queen of the
I
world.
would so easily go drunk with power. I know myself. The executions would start imminently. I cannot be trusted.
I don't know. Make Elle Jones queen of the world.
I mean, Robespierre was cool when he started too, right? Like when you read Robespierre,
be
when you
Bernita
read
as
Robespierre, you're like,
a
I
certain
agree with
general.
everything Robespierre said. And then you're like, other than like, literally the streets running with blood, like, there was that piece.
W.E. Du Bois was a communist, but did not want the communist revolution to have like the pitchforks, like what happened in Russia and China. He want a
Yeah.
peaceful revolution.
I believe in peace. I'm just saying that can't be trusted. Had somebody absolute power, the next thing you know, you're like, just this one little execution. And then the next thing you know, it's like, so.
That would so be me. That would definitely so be me. I thought you were against the death penalty. Against these guys that overthrew the Syrian Arab Republic? No way.
Can't be trusted, man. Because humans can't be trusted. We should cut this bit. It might be seen as insensitive. Okay.
Nah,
All right.
But
no.
it's a question. It's a question that we do have to. No, it's yeah. No,
it's a real question. Like, I mean, this is actually a question for the left, like the authoritarian left, that does actually just want to replace existing power structures with our own power structures. And in fact, of course, true liberation is dismantling those power structures, which also means dismantling in ourselves, which is our impulse to cause harm to others, our impulse to get revenge. This is exactly what abolition talks about. So we're joking about, but this is the ethical question of abolition. What do I do with the person that murders my family? And if I'm a true abolitionist, I have to be also like to understand that no prison for them either. And that's the most difficult leap, right? Like, so yeah, I mean, these are the deep ethical questions that what we actually do with our own power and how do we maintain a liberationist, principled, ethical outlook on the world, no matter what tests us. So, yeah.
I still think we should have Elle Jones, Queen of the World. But that's to be continued on.
To be continued. I have to go prep for class, which I had all day to do, yet did not do. Okay.
Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Elle Jones, Canadian Black leftist, social justice, racial justice activist, feminist, anti-imperialist poet, journalist, often for Black Power Hour, Halifax Examiner, and The Breach. She's a professor who teaches at Mount St. Vincent University. The author of a collection of her poetry is Life at the African Resistance. Her latest book is Abolitionist Intimacies. She's a social justice warrior, as I said. That's always a compliment in my eyes. An abolitionist and animal rights advocate, a super lefty heroine and flaming left-winger. Don't forget, folks, to donate to 1+1. Dr. Jones, Elle Jones, thank you so much for giving me your precious time on a Sunday. And again, happy Black History. Happy Black History Month.
Happy Black Liberation Month.
Happy Black History Month to you and yours. And since it's Black History Month, I hope we can have you back on again. But until then, all my best and, good night and good luck.
Okay. Take care. Bye.